Oh, there we go. In this video, we're going to talk about the role of language in our sociological understanding of culture. And we talk about language as being a really specific and very, very important aspect of understanding cultures in the society and the societies that we live in. And we could talk about that for a number of reasons, and that, I mean, we'll get into the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis and all that sort of piece, but what you need to understand is that language, in a lot of ways, is one of the things that allows human societies to have what we understand as culture. And the reason for that, and I will ask you to think about if you have ever played charades, the reason for that is that there are some things that are really, really important to, for example, the society that we live in today, that are very hard to express without an idea of language. So think about playing charades, and think about what would happen if you picked up a slip of paper from whatever receptacle you're using to play charades, and you have a slip of paper on it that says democracy. How do you communicate democracy without language? Okay. And I would imagine most of you just went, oh, that would be really hard. And it is. It's really, really, really hard. We use language to do that because language allows us to talk or communicate, I guess, really about three things that are very difficult to do without language. It's really hard to sort of develop a shared understanding of them. One of them is to talk about abstract ideas, right? So democracy is something that's fundamentally built on an understanding of where power should rest and how decisions should be made. And that's an abstract idea. So democracy is an example of how we need to be able to communicate about abstract ideas. But the other two things that are really important in terms of communicating through culture and cultural ideas specifically, and why that make language so important in our discussion of culture, is that language allows us to talk about the past, i.e., what happened before, and it allows us to talk about what we want to do in the future. And that idea about the past and what we remember, and the future and what we are aiming for, are really fundamentally connected to ideas about culture because they are about aspirations, they are ways of communicating value. They're super, super, super important for that. And again, please think about how you would communicate last Tuesday playing charades, and you will get a quick sense of like, oh, no, we need language. And we sort of talk about that in sociology as being a really important piece from a sort of sociological perspective, because as far as we understand it right now, and this may be slightly different, we may be wrong about this and shown wrong about this in the future, human beings are the only creature that does have that communication about abstract ideas, the past, and the future, and they're all really fundamental aspects of how we understand culture. So that's kind of a why language matters piece. And then the other part that I want to talk about in this video about language is the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which is really, really, really important in terms of how we understand language socially. And it basically says that the languages we speak determine the thoughts that we are able to have. So this is basically an argument that when human beings think, they're thinking in language, that they use language to organize their thoughts even internally. And this is not necessarily this is the only way we can think, right? Like we can think in pictures and stuff like that. But when we think about language in the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, this becomes really, really important when we start talking about that idea that language allows us to communicate about abstract ideas, the past and the future. So for those of you who have read 1984, if you remember reading 1984 in your high school English classes, there's a lot of stuff in 1984 that sort of fits in that idea of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, right? If you change the way you talk about the past, then you are changing sort of the ideas that you can express in the present. And a lot of the examples of how the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis works that are accessible and reasonable to a lot of students, it come from sort of studies of indigenous languages from an anthropological perspective. But You get lots of examples, right? So think about how do you deal with, right, the ownership of property, right? The ownership of objects, whatever pieces of material culture that you're talking, that you find relevant in a group of people. If you have a word for ours, as in belonging to the group, but you don't have a word for mine, as in belonging to me as an individual, right? And that shifts certain things around what you might express around, for example, fairness and cake between you and your siblings at the dinner table, right? Like there's all kinds of things that come up and come out of that. And this goes way beyond the sort of very like, oh, did you know the Inuit have 35 words for snow, which is true, uh, but that's not the crux of this. The crux of this is not, well, the Inuit need to talk about snow and the Bedouins in the Sahara need to talk about sand. This is a conversation that extends into our ideas about what matters, the values that we express. We're going to get into sort of some judgment of culture and ethnocentrism and cultural relativism later on, but for now, like understand that when we talk about the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis and that language controls thought, we mean a lot of different things, right? In terms of how we construct what we think is important and how we use language to tell us what in the world around us to pay attention to and what is meaningful. And the other piece that I sort of want to do in the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is just a very quick review of what that is and what sort of contributes to that. So one of the pieces of that is what we refer to as linguistic determinism, and that is essentially the language or languages you speak determine what you are able to think about. And I can give you sort of a very quick example of what that looks like. I grew up doing French immersion schooling and I did a lot of it and I still remember a lot of it. So there are things, and those of you who speak more than one language will probably be aware of this, that you can express in some languages but not in others. And one of my favorite examples in French is the verb fouiller, which is the word for to search frantically without much focus or planning. And it's kind of like shuffling through papers and it's kind of like tossing through drawers, but there is a way of looking for things that you can express in French that just like I can express it in English, but it is not the same and I have to like go through a bunch of steps to explain that. So linguistic determinism, the language or languages you speak shape what you can think about and what thoughts you can sort of concretize in your head. That's half of it. The other half of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is what we call linguistic relativism, which is to say that language is firmly anchored in culture, and that culture is what gives language its meaning. So, for example, there's nothing inherent in the letters CAT that indicate the gray furry creature who appears in these videos sometimes, because that, and there's nothing about the sound cat that indicates the same thing. But when I say cat, you have an image in your head that pretty well accords with the one that runs around our house often, with or without sort of ever having seen them. And we can do that and we can have that conversation because the shared cultural understanding of that sound and that word kind of create that. There are spaces where the same words or the same ideas might mean different things, right? So we talked a little bit about democracy early on in terms of examples of abstract ideas, but when you think about the idea of democracy, do you think it's a good thing? Because there are places where you don't, and there are places where democracy means very different things. So, for example, throughout most of the sort of history of the USSR before that sort of splintered in 1989, there were elections. People voted. It was just that you could only vote for the member of the Communist Party. And most people in the West don't think about that as democracy. But the people inside the Soviet Union at the time, that was their expression of democracy. That made sense. So the meaning of terms can shift based on the cultural context that you sort of are occupying. And a sort of more contemporary example there might be the use of slang, and I'm not going to try that. But I'm not going to try to do this any justice. But I have a friend who is a kindergarten teacher who tried to explain to me what the meaning of the word bussin is in terms of identifying something that is desirable. I can't explain it, but she sort of insists that this is what her students use, and she teaches kindergarten. So there's some conversations around sort of slang and the way that language changes that is, again, firmly based in culture, including subcultures and countercultures, and we will get to that later on in this playlist.